All right, you guys ready? Oh,
Yeah.
we don't need a wrench in my pocket. Are you happy? Good. Okay, here we go. 5, 4, 3, and let's do it.
Yo, welcome to the Bub and Bob Show. I am Bub Coons, and right over there is Bob Matosian. Say hi.
How you doing?
There you go. My guest today, first of all, I just kind of warn people that normally watch this that are 12, 13, 14 years old. Our typical kind of stuff that maybe PG-13 may go into the R-rated stuff, but this stuff is incredibly important to talk about. My guest today is the Executive Director of Operation Integrity. He's the author of a few books, including one called When Lost Men Come Home. Please welcome the lovingly valiant David Zailer.
Woo!
Well, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, it's
And,
welcome to the
thanks
show.
for that. Those
Nice
kind
shirt,
words.
Dave.
Yeah.
And thank you, Bob. It used to be red.
Yeah,
It did.
it looks good on camera now that it's all that red. Yeah, because you can see kind of in the sleeves.
It
has a
used to
little
be
bit-
red, but I've had it for a long time.
Yeah,
Oh,
So
It's
almost
kinda-
since when I was a young man. So it's been quite
there you
a
go.
while.
Well,
oh yeah,
it
that is a
works.
while, huh?
Yeah, I know this is going to get heavy. You know, this is our past, and I want to talk through life with you, and then the point where who you were before Christ, who you were after, and so if you want to back up as far as you can and just kind of tell me what it was like growing up with your dad, your family, what'd you do, and what you got caught up in, and then let's just keep the conversation, open and honest.
Okay, well, I grew up not knowing how abnormal my life was because it was all that I knew. Houston, middle class, and my father was a tremendously popular and spectacular church musician. Back in the 70s, he was the equivalent of a worship leader rock star.
Okay.
And our church basically, our life basically evolved around him and his role, both in church, and so it was programmed. It was somewhat on stage, if not literally on stage, but how one behaved, and church was very much cultured,
Okay.
and a lot of secrets in the family. My mother had a long history of mental illness. As I've gotten older, I realized that I think a lot of her severe depression was related to being married to my father. She ultimately ended up committing suicide.
Sorry.
And my father also had a severe pornography habit, long before we would ever talk about pornography.
Yeah, and back when there wasn't the access that we have, which is incredibly dangerous. So.
The links that he went to get the
Right.
stuff that he had, it was extraordinary.
Yeah.
So he was, fair to say he was deeply addicted, but we didn't know those terms
Right.
back then.
Did you just sense that something was wrong, or did he act? I mean, obviously, he's playing at churches and coming home. Is there a big difference between what you see at church and what you see at
Sure.
home? Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm working on a new book, and I was just writing about how the ride to church on Sunday mornings was usually volatile and angry. My father would be upset with my sister, and they would argue, but then we'd all get out of the car and walk into church with our smiles on.
Right. Right.
And I found my father's pornography stash about 2 weeks after I was molested by one of my father's friends, someone from church.
Yeah.
I was 8. And even when it happened, I didn't have understanding of what happened, but I already knew that there was no way I could go tell my father. I had already experienced, and I saw in the family, when things happened that didn't make him happy, the result would be punishment.
Wow. Could you tell anyone?
No.
Nobody.
There was no
safe
and
place.
I didn't even know what to tell,
Right.
because in the 60s there was no conversation about that. And as it worked out, it was about 2 weeks after that I was just messing around in the garage, and I found his stash hidden in the garage. And so it was a bit of a 1-2 punch for me. But, you know, as a child, you just kind of get up and go on. And
You were 8 at this
Yeah.
time?
I was 8. There was
Yeah.
actually 3 episodes, but they all happened between 8 and 9 years of age. The same perpetrator, very similar situations each time.
Wow.
And so
Yeah. So then you found that, then and you just started. What happened? You just
well,
personally.
I was intrigued by it. I mean, I don't
course.
know what child would not be intrigued by pornography. My father's pornography was kind of a broad genre, you might say. Knowing what I know now, I can give myself a degree of understanding to realize that as a boy, when I would see what we would consider as normal pornography, men having sex with women, I would look at that and I would just I was just intuitively attracted to the women.
Sure.
And I envied the men for being able to be in these positions and to be interacting and being physical and sexual with these women.
Yeah.
Even at 8 years old, I
Yeah.
was thinking that.
Well, that's why it's so tempting and intriguing and so dangerous to me. It's the lure is already kind of naturally in you.
Why, sure. And my father also had homosexual pornography.
No, okay.
So as a boy, I would look at that, and I realize now, looking back at that, I was trying to unpack what I had experienced.
Oh, right.
And there was a certain degree of repulsion, and certain confusion there, a lot of comparison. And the worst part for me was when I realized that while my father's looking at this, he's sleeping with my mother, and the way he's treating my mother. Now, I'm sharing this now from the viewpoint of, 50 years later.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was beyond comprehension. It was beyond any degree of understanding or sorting it through. And the guilt that I felt, because I knew when I was looking at it that this was not good.
Right.
And it certainly violated all of the corrective teaching I'd gotten at church. But I couldn't keep myself from coming back to it.
Right.
And so, using the terms of addiction, which, as you know, that's the world that I work in now, is in the addiction education and recovery world. That's one of the hallmark indicators of addiction. We stop our addictions all the time.
Right.
It's how long or are we able to stay stopped?
Yeah.
And that's the recovery question.
Right.
So there did come a point where my sister actually confronted my father about it. I had told her about it at one point, and my sister she's never been afraid of anyone.
Yeah.
And so she confronted him, and that stash of pornography disappeared. But I would later find it other places.
Yeah. And probably went looking for it. Right.
Not really.
Oh,
I
really?
just would
So
find
it's
it.
just-
Like one day I went, my mom's car when I was a teenager, my mom's car had a flat tire. And so I went to my father's car, to the trunk to get some of the tools to change the tire. And underneath the mat in his trunk was a bunch more pornography.
So I just
stuff.
relocated it all.
Sure.
So what was your relationship with your father like? Was it, did you despise him? Was it gross? Did you just go, no, I don't know
Well,
what
at
to
that
do?
point, I certainly, I'd never wanted to be in a room with him anymore.
Okay.
Not alone.
Right.
And I respected my father behaviorally because I was a peacekeeper,
Okay.
but I didn't have any true authentic respect for the man.
Right. And how was the balance of the church? I mean, what was the church didn't know? They didn't know how to respond at that time. They did
didn't
know. They didn't have a clue.
And our family, we were his secret keepers.
Okay.
Looking back now, and unpacking the family dynamic after all these years, I realized that we were essentially groomed to be his secret keepers.
Wow. Okay. And how many in your family? How many siblings?
My mom, my sister, and I.
And
I was the youngest.
Okay. Okay. So you saw this stuff early on,
Yeah.
and what did that lead to? What happened after your 10, 11, 12 up to 20? What's the course of your life? What did it take then?
Well, at some point in time, pornography would come across my path, like
Yeah.
it does just about for anybody. It was, I didn't realize how much I had been set up for addiction.
Okay.
In my 20s, I discovered beer.
Me too.
Like most people in their 20s
Yeah.
discover beer, or if not in their
Something.
teens.
Yeah.
But I became an alcoholic
Okay.
very quickly, even almost with the first drink. It was a profound,
Wow.
good feeling for me. I remember having a feeling that felt so good. I was like, wow, I didn't know anyone could feel like this. And very quickly I became what would be clinically defined as an alcoholic, and the fact that I was beginning to have negative consequences. It was having a destructive impact on my life. But I couldn't stop doing it because it made me feel good.
Yeah.
And I had never felt good before. From the alcohol, I started becoming quite promiscuous. A lot of women. The drugs came online. And then in my mid to late 20s, I actually, my girlfriend, the girlfriend I had at the time, was making porn movies. And we both had drug habits. And I had, even from a child, like I mentioned, I had always envied
Right.
the men who could be with these wonderful, beautiful women. And so I became one of them. And immediately found out that I didn't like it. So I didn't stay in that very long, but I stayed in the culture and in the connections and for quite a while. In fact, even today, 30 plus years later, I still have a few long distance friendships with people I knew back then.
Wow.
In that we've all grown.
Yeah.
We're all sober now.
Yeah.
We're all realize that we're the lucky ones
Yeah.
to be alive.
And they're all out of the industry now.
Yes.
The ones?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and because we're all old.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully, I mean, you wouldn't be in it anyway. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously. but,
there's
I mean,
probably a market for
Yeah.
for old folks,
Yeah.
but
there's-
yeah. No, I never was. I never wanted to be that kind of center of attention.
Okay.
But it was something that from a child, there was an intrigue there, and there was a kind of a compulsion implanted
Yeah.
there from the experiences that I had had. And so I gave it a shot
Yeah.
and found out real quickly that it wasn't fun, and it's not what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, and it's. I mean, the sense that it's not real as well. From, I've heard from anywhere that some people are at gunpoint to some people are taking drugs, and it's how they live through their drugs because they do that service. And
Right.
It's not this glamorous. You're out, everybody's having fun, and it's this consensual sex thing, and it's brutal on that side as I've read. But I mean, you have to have some kind of real battle going on in your mind and your soul and your heart because you're half in the church with your dad growing up there. Then you get into this stuff and you're like, is God real? I mean, at what point do you go, all that was nonsense, or God started to move you into going, you're real and I need a savior? I mean, about what age was that, and when did that happen, or how did it happen?
Well, from my church training, I always had this, I'll even use the word compulsion or compulsive thought that I needed to go to church. It was to distill the training that I got culturally is that good people and good Christians go to church. If you want to be a good Christian, if you want to be a good person, you need to go to church.
Okay.
And so I would go through spells where I would habitually go to church through my 20s and into my 30s. And when I was 30, I was no longer, at that point, I was no longer, I wanted to have nothing to do with porn as any kind of activity.
Right.
But I had a drinking problem and a drug problem. I had a business by that point. It was making good money. And so I would go to church on the weekends. And I would go weeks and sometimes months without drinking, but always missed it. And then when I would start drinking and using drugs again, I would quit going to church.
Right.
And then when I got sober, I was actually 41 when I got sober.
Okay.
I'm 61 now, so thankfully I've been
20 years.
20
Congratulations.
years. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. I went into a treatment program, and my counselor says to me at my second or third appointment with him, he says to me, "Now, David, I look at your paperwork and it says that you're a Christian." I go, "Yeah, I'm Christian, born and raised." He goes, "Oh, so tell me about that." So I started telling him everything I knew about Jesus from my flannel graph
Right.
theological teachings from Sunday school.
Yeah.
And he's sitting there, and he puts his hands up. He says, "Stop, stop, stop." I go, "What?" He said, I don't want to hear any more about that." And I was offended. It's like, "What do you mean? I'm talking about Jesus here."
Right.
And he says, "Well, you may think you're talking about Jesus, but I don't think you know what you're talking about."
Oh.
And he said, "You know, whatever you call it, what you have now doesn't seem to have done you a whole lot of good, has it?"
Fair question.
And then he says, "Our time is up." And he ushers me out of his office.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I walked out of his office and was checking my voicemail. And and on the voicemail, there was like 4 really bad news messages in a row, all consequential, related to my drug use
Sure.
and my alcoholism. And later on that night, I stood in a parking lot here in Orange County, and it was a cold evening, or cold for us here in Orange County.
Yeah. 60.
And I remember standing outside, shivering, chain smoking cigarettes, trying to stay warm. And I was thinking, okay, I'm in this treatment program. I had gotten arrested for drugs, so I had some legal issues that I was facing. My attorney wanted a whole lot of money, and I was struggling to pay the bills for the attorney. My family would not speak to me. My father wouldn't speak to me. My friends were barely tolerating me. I had had several overdoses.
Wow.
And all I wanted at that moment was cocaine and heroin. That's all that I wanted. And I remember thinking, oh my God, God, I don't know who you are. I'm a drug addict. And if you don't help me, I'm gonna die. I'll call you any name you want me to. Anything. I'm just asking not to die. And in a moment, just like it just happened here, I was reflecting on it, I heard a voice. Bub, I don't know if I heard it here or if I heard it here, but it was distinct, and it says to me, "All right, David, now I can go to work." And my first thought was, oh my God, he called me by name. He called me by name. And I immediately felt this sense of accompaniment, presence.
It was comforting? Was it?
The comfort came
Okay.
in just knowing that someone answered my prayer. That was it.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times as a teenager, or as a young adult, I prayed all of the religious prayers that I had been taught to pray, and I had walked down the aisle, and I had filled out the card, and I had gone to the men's retreats, and I had done every church-trained cultural hoop jumping that I was told to do, and always walked away, felt like I had more push-ups to do.
Wow.
And now I had presence. And over the next few weeks, I just began to have this deeper ongoing dialogue with my friend, the voice. I gave this presence a name because I didn't know what to call it.
Right.
My friend, the voice. And it would go like this. In the shower, my friend, the voice, would say, "Hey, we slept well last night." Yeah, we did. "Well, let's just go out and do it again today. We stayed sober. How many days sober now?" "Oh, we're like 90 days sober." "Well, let's go make it 91. That was it. Very simple,
Yeah.
very elemental.
Day by day. Yeah.
Day by day. And then I started reading books. And I read a Buddhist book, which I enjoyed, and it was helpful. But I didn't sense that my friend, the voice, was in that book. And I read some other books. I read a New Age book on crystals.
You're trying anything, right?
I was.
Yeah.
And sorry for the ramble here.
No, it's quite all right.
So the idea came to me that I should read the Bible. Now, I had all kinds of Bibles because, when you grow up like I did, they give you a Bible
Sure.
every 6 months.
Yeah.
Just kind of refresher, read this, kid. And I knew from my church training that I should start reading in the book of John. So I started reading, and I see the word God, and I just close the Bible, and I feel the bubbling up of rage. And I start reading again, and I see the word Jesus, and I close the Bible. And I had all the feelings related to the heartbreak and the abandonment of my childhood church experience.
Yeah.
And I could not get past this. And so I said to my friend, the voice, I said, "You know what? If you want me to do this, you need to help me here. Because I'll go get me a Hindu book or something. Because I can't do this." And the idea came to me, just like that. The idea came to me, if you can't handle the word God in the Bible, here's some good heresy here, by the way.
Yeah.
Some people are going to hate this. Put your finger over it and replace it with the word truth. And if you can't handle the name Jesus, put your finger over it and replace it with the word love. So and my friend, the voice, says, "Can you do that?" I go, "Yeah, I can do that." "Well, then just give that a try."
Yeah.
So I opened back up my Bible, and I continued to read, and it basically read to me like this. "So truth so loved the world that he gave his love. And if you believe in his love, you don't have to die." That's how it was translating to me.
Right.
And I continued to read through the Gospels. And as I read through the Gospels, these people started popping up off the page as highlighted characters. The woman at the well, the lepers, the paralytic, the man who says, "Oh, help me with my, I believe, help me in my unbelief." These people who'd been small bit characters on some sort of theological stage were now popping up as the main character who's interacting with Jesus.
Yeah.
Without seeing these characters, the gospel of Jesus gets lost.
Absolutely.
And I saw that these were the people who were guiding me empathetically. They were guiding me to Jesus from their own broken experience, because that's what broken people do.
Yeah.
And I began to fall in love with these people, and I began to understand, there's nothing bad about them at all. And I began to think, I have a kinship with them. And then I get into Acts, and I get into Romans, and I get into Romans.
Yeah, great.
And reading Romans 7, where
Yeah.
Paul says, I do the very things I don't want to
Yeah.
do, and I don't do what I should do. What a wretched man! And I'm reading this, go, oh my gosh, this is exactly what us alcoholics say all the time.
Yes, yeah.
Paul's a freaking
He's
alcoholic.
addicted to something.
And now also I'm angry because no one had ever pointed this out to me before.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people in churches want to kind of jump around that Romans 7
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
And then I turn the page and I see Romans 8:1 that says, but there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And I remember I pushed my chair back from the desk. This was all happening in my office.
Yeah.
And I sat there and I said, oh my gosh, I'm a Christian. And for a moment I began to panic because I did not know how to be a Christian except the way I was taught to be a Christian in my toxic church upbringing.
Which seemed to be shame-based or guilt-based.
Very
or-
shame-based,
It's like, if you don't do this, there's consequences, better do that, or you're not a good kid if you don't go to church.
So that was about 20 years ago, and I've spent the last 20 years learning what it means to live in Christ with no condemnation.
Yeah.
That's my journey.
That's amazing. And so when did you get involved, and when did you start Operation Integrity? What led to that?
I was about 3 years sober, and my sponsor from AA, he had this wonderful 12-step meeting at his church, and I was actually going to this church by then, and he said, we need to start a group to help guys with porn, and you're going to run it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. He goes, oh, yes, you are. You know you will. I go, no, I'm not. And for the next 6-8 weeks, I was just like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm just happy doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Wasn't looking at porn, and certainly had been part of my history, and I'd certainly identified it as an area of addiction for me. And then the pastor of the church saw me one day, and he goes, David, I hear that you're going to start a group to help guys with porn. And he said, that's just fantastic. You're the best man for the job. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's no way out of this.
Yeah.
So a couple of months later, me and 2 guys sat down, and I was the only one with any kind of recovery experience. And I said, well, gentlemen, I really don't know what we're going to do, but we got a Patrick Carnes book that we read through that was very helpful. And we got some other literature. And then we started, I started just making notes of these wonderful conversations that we had. And I was bringing in the 12 steps that were being very beneficial to us as a group and to us individually. And I would go home and I would type into the computer these wonderful things that these men were discovering and what they were sharing with one another. And that became our first book, the first edition of When Lost Men Come Home. And then we, at some point, we knew we needed to establish our identity, so we became a corporation and became a nonprofit.
Right.
And
when did that start? What year did that start? Do you remember?
we incorporated in 2006.
Okay. So 13 strong,
Yeah, so we're coming up on close to 15 years now. So our job is to help inform people about addiction and help guide them into effective community.
Okay.
That's what we do.
Yeah. I want to talk about that real quick, the sexual, the pornography, the sexual addiction, because I think we all recognize if someone overdrinks that they're stumbling in the bushes, or if you do drugs, nobody wants to do that. They go to hospitals and they OD, but no one wants to deal with sex. No one wants to deal with sex in a whole lot in the churches and the schools. That's like off boundaries. You don't hear a lot of nonprofits talking about pornography and sexual addiction because they don't want to jump into people's lives and go, well, you do what you want to with and especially now today where it's kind of just a sexual revolution going on. That's what it's so dangerous. Do you have what does it do to the mind and the soul in the heart of a person who's addicted to that?
Well, that's a huge question that I don't think we've ever learned to answer that question fully.
Right.
I think first and foremost we need to understand that pornography is a drug,
Okay.
and it is a drug, and it has very similar impact upon the brain as any other drug does.
Okay.
It intoxicates, and to whatever degree that pleasurable intoxication comes, then you have, almost in a whiplash sense, you have the boomerang of the exact opposite that's even greater. I certainly, research now shows that pornography has a lot of the same impact on neurochemistry as the stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, and interestingly enough, when the brain is intoxicated on a regular basis, it changes the way it functions. And our frontal cortex, which is where we really where we have a higher functioning, that's where we are truly functioning as human beings.
Okay.
It's where we have our art and our emotion, our relationships, our interaction. That part of the brain becomes less active. And so people, one of the very insidious side effects is that people tend to have impairment and lowered ability to function in relationships.
Right.
So their ability to be in, and here's the great heartbreak of any kind of sexual addiction or unhealthy sexual behavior, whatever you want to term
Right.
it, is that the underlying drive is for connection and intimacy. And yet the behavior impairs the individual so much that connection and intimacy become more difficult.
Right.
And that's not just the slippery slope, that's the spiral. Because if I'm suffering an impairment and loss of ability to connect and be close and intimate, then the counterfeits, whether it's the quick, easy sexual relationship, the pornography, which mostly always goes hand in hand, pardon the pun,
Yeah.
with compulsive masturbation,
Okay.
is that these things become more likely because they are so convenient and they are so compelling,
Yeah.
and they are a short-term answer. But then again, once more, the ability to connect and be intimate is withered,
Yeah.
and that's the spiral.
Yeah, I read an article last night actually where this guy had been heavily involved in pornography for a long time, and he knew that it wasn't fulfilling at all, and so he started to try to stop and everything, and then he started to realize and see, his sister and his mother differently. He got a lot of help, but he said at the beginning, when I met this girl that I truly wanted to like, I couldn't even imagine her unless she was on a television. Or a screen. His whole connection was with a screen, and with people that weren't real. And he finally realized that the screen was connected to his visuals, and he went through some help to stop it. And that's how.
Right.
And like you said, when I'm sure addictions have different levels and different intensity in everyone. When you had your first beer, it just hit you. Some people have their first beer and they go on, but I don't imagine that's the same with pornography. I think as men, we're already kind of wired to be attractive to women. So when you throw out little, images all over the internet, or you're driving down and see a billboard, it's working against you constantly, and it's hard to battle. I imagine everyone in this studio has battled with it to some degree, whether they don't want to look at it or they've tested it. But it's such a what are your first steps to help someone even see that and then move from that false enslavement to some freedom and intimacy? What's some advice?
Well, I think first and foremost, very practically, people need to make themselves safe. We live in a world, and you mentioned it. In fact, I just recently got a device so that I could watch Amazon and Netflix on my television.
Right.
And there it is. It's got a browser.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, a browser. I didn't expect that. Fortunately, I've gotten to the point where I've worked hard at my recovery, and I'm in the habit of not looking at pornography, and I enjoy living a life that's free of pornography.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And this is where I think the support groups, whether it's a church-based support group, a 12-step based support group, and my favorites are the Christ-centered 12-step support groups, because again, the great deficiency for the individual is connection.
Right.
And in order to have a long-term success and building a life free of addiction and pornography, yes, we can do certain things to essentially eliminate the conveniences.
Right.
Smartphones have to be very careful. You can make smartphones safe, but if they're not safe, it's like an alcoholic
Yeah.
walking
There's
around
ways
with a
around it. Yeah.
yeah. And if it's not safe, it's like an alcoholic walking around with a vodka bottle in his back pocket. But even over and above that, the creating of connections and one of the deep underlying chains of addiction is secrecy and isolation.
And that's based on what? Fear, shame, just
Shame, and again the relational impairment.
Okay.
I think in our conversation with pornography, it's not as hard as we might imagine for people to say, "Oh yeah, I've got a problem with pornography." The great shame is not that people are watching pornography, but it's admitting the level of enslavement.
Right.
It's admitting that they have a deep vulnerability and powerlessness. That's something that they're in the grips of something bigger than they are. So the great admission is not just that I look at pornography. The great admission is that I have a deep powerlessness.
Yeah.
Because now I'm admitting something that's pathetic and heartbreaking. So now I began to admit, I recognize myself as like that leper who's clamoring after Jesus for some healing.
Took a lot for that leper to come up.
Desperation.
Yeah, desperate. Yeah.
Listen, let me tell you, desperation,
Honest
is
desperation.
a beautiful motivation.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, you were there, right? We've all been there where you cried out and said, "God, I'm gonna die if you don't do that." It says desperate surrender, right? And that's when you first kind of heard, God, really.
Well, I don't think Jesus is going to be anything for any of us until he's first and foremost our Savior.
Right.
And the rest comes after that.
Yeah. You said something to me on the phone the other day where a lot of people just throw behavioral things in you, but I forgot how you phrased it, but maybe you can remember where it's not just a series of don't do anything until this gets gospel centered. Because otherwise you're just going to fill it with anything else, right?
Right. Well, and let's be honest. I mean, the addiction recovery process tends to be, we tend to give up, the worst thing, and then when I got sober, but I was smoking cigarettes, I suddenly went to 2 or 3 packs a day.
You trade it all for something, right?
And then when I quit smoking cigarettes, mysteriously in about 6 months, I gained 15 pounds.
Yeah, started eating.
And that's right, Carl's Genius.
Yeah.
Started off there on every corner.
Yeah.
So there's certainly kind of a walking back
Yeah.
and walking towards health in that way. But I think the great value of the 12-step programs, in fact, a friend of mine, you may know this, but I moonlight on faculty with the Leadership Institute.
I didn't know.
And a great organization. It's a Christian spiritual formation organization that has a very deep interest in addiction. And one of them was sharing with me an article and I'm embarrassed to say I forgot where it's from. But it was a series of religious scholars who said that the 12-step programs are America's gift of spirituality to the world.
I know it's helped a lot of people.
Yes.
Because it's
And-
foundationally from Scripture. I mean,
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's scriptural principles. The beauty in the fact is that it's changed the language so that it challenges our religious thinking.
Right. That's
Because our
interesting,
religious
yeah.
thinking has never gotten us where we needed to be, as proven by our alcoholism or our porn addiction or
Whatever else there is.
whatever it
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
But what that has done is that it started a movement of people who realized that recovery is not about stopping. It's about building a life so that starting again no longer makes sense.
Unpack that a
That's
little
the
bit.
difference.
Unpack that a little bit.
Well, I don't know of anybody that doesn't have a terrible time stopping their addictions.
Right.
It's how long do they stay stopped?
Okay.
And I know for me the thing
So you're always battling it. Does it? But
I don't battle it. People
okay.
say,
So
well,
you right.
yeah, I don't as a recovering alcoholic, I don't battle with alcoholism or alcohol.
Right.
Because I realize that it beat me fair and square.
Right.
My life in recovery has taken me to the point where I am learning things and building a life where I don't need or have this compulsive kind of hook in the mouth,
Right.
compelling urge to go rekindle my former misery.
Right. But how long did that take?
You know, I remember early on in actually my first couple of weeks when I went into treatment, I remember thinking, you know, all right, I'm going to give this a shot. If they can teach me how not to be miserable, I'm all ears.
Right.
That's exactly what I was
Right.
thinking. If you can teach me how not to be miserable, I'm open.
So all these things that you were doing to make yourself not miserable, and so you wouldn't feel certain things were actually making you miserable, you came to that conclusion like, I'm just miserable no matter
Well,
what I do.
I came to terms with how miserable I was when I quit drinking for a while.
Okay.
And I quit taking drugs for a while.
Because you had nothing to medicate. You're just dealing with reality, and it
Yeah.
just wasn't.
Yeah.
You
And
didn't
actually
like
had
it?
a great life. Beautiful house not far from the beach.
Yeah.
Drove a Corvette, a
Yeah.
red one.
Oh, nice. Match your shirt.
Yeah. And it was less faded than my shirt.
Yeah.
It's hard to think and it's hard to identify misery when that's all you've known.
Right.
Because you don't have anything to contrast it with.
No.
But at some point I realized, you know, if you just show me how to be happy, I'm all up for
Yeah.
that.
Whatever that takes, I'm in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I started working as the steps, as they
Right.
say.
Right.
And I was learning things, certainly having certain awarenesses build within me. And I started having moments where I said, you know, I like these people. I like these people in recovery. I had a moment one time at a 12-step meeting. I was just a few months sober. And this guy who is about my age, and I'd seen him there, and he was one of the guys who'd been sober for a long time. And, you know, I was one of the new guys.
Yeah.
And he comes up to me, he goes, hey, how you doing? He tells me his name, and I tell him my name. He goes, so David, are you an alcoholic? And I looked at him and I said, I guess so. You know, they tell me I am. A psychiatrist told me I am. I said, I really drank myself crazy. But I don't know. I don't know what to think. He says, well, I'm an alcoholic. You want to come sit with me?
Wow.
And the way he said that was so free and absent of shame.
Yeah.
His offering himself to me as an alcoholic was his gift to me.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, you bet. And I remember I just trotted in there right after him and sat down next to him. And I was like, wow, what was that? I didn't understand at the time what it was. It was empathy.
Yeah.
And here's something that I've actually been thinking about this the last few
Big.
months.
Yeah.
Jesus is God's gift of empathy. God became man, lived amongst sinners, was judged and condemned as sin and crucified. Why? So that we could become righteous before God.
Yes.
That's God's great empathy. God became man for us.
Absolutely.
And in the recovery movement, and this is, I think, the relational support value and of the movement of the recovery movement is people being gifts of empathy for others.
Right. Yeah, we're blessed so we can be a blessing. Yeah.
Sure.
And so, is there any? What part did? I mean, when do you think that you actually gave your life to Christ, and what part, when you look back, do you see that He played? Whether it was, bumping into a certain person, or reading the book, or just being that voice. Like what happened there between this kind of fake growing up at a weird church with the weird things going on,
Right.
your struggle with not even being able to say God or Jesus,
Right.
then your surrender, and now you're a believer, and you realize, oh man, I'm a Christian.
Right.
How did He help with your addiction, and what kind of path was that?
I realize now that God had always been with
Right.
me. And even as a teenager, I would sit on my bed trying to read my Bible, and praying, and feeling like God was, pissed off. So
Yeah.
He was. And interestingly enough, when my father was mad, he would go silent.
Yeah.
And God seemed to be silent with me.
So your connection to the Heavenly Father was directly related to your
Very
earthly father.
very similar to that.
Right.
But looking back now, my life was preserved in many life-threatening situations, and I survived several overdoses. I had violent situations that my drug addiction put me into that I survived. I got a few scars, but I survived. I have my sanity. I have my health. Physically, I'm healthy. Not everybody with my background from alcohol and drug use can say that.
Right.
So I see God's applied gentleness to me in the form of protection
Right.
and patience. And from where I sit now, Bub, I wouldn't want it any other way.
Right.
I've had my moment of Gethsemane. And that sense of vulnerability and failure, abandonment, knowing that people want to harm you. And God, as I had known Him, God as He had been preached to me, was not going to save me. So the deal for me was that I said, God, if you don't, whoever you are, if you don't help me, I'm going to die. That was my first moment of surrender, where I gave up my life that had never been working.
Right.
And I was willing to take whatever life God would give me, because it's either that or die. So yes, we can talk about it in certain kind of like hallmark moments. But what prepared me for the hallmark moments was everything up to that point.
Of course, yeah.
And
Hey, Dave, fascinating to me is the moment when you read in Scripture that there is no condemnation, and yet your picture of Christianity was 100% condemnation, right? I mean, you were brought up in an environment where it was always do the right thing, and you're not good enough, and you need to do better, and all this makeup to cover up everything that wasn't right. I mean, talked about those two contrasts of the Christianity that you understood that was all condemnation, and the new Christianity that says there's now no condemnation.
A real
Yes.
Christianity, yeah.
well, the first moment of freedom, if you've never had it, is an inexplicable moment. we've in our social media things, we see these images of animals who've been raised in cages, and they're set free to go out into the field for the first time, and they walk out and they're like paralyzed.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do. That's a little bit like what coming into the freedom of Christ has been for me. I come out and go, huh? It's like, what do I do now? Because I don't have any reference for it. I don't have any previous experience of it. But that's okay, because the most profound thing Jesus ever says to any of us is the first thing he says: follow me. And he doesn't give us an exact destination other than himself.
What are the I mean, what can the church, what's the good thing that the church can do? What are the current stats are, if you look across I've heard this said, I don't know how accurate it is, maybe you do. You look across the landscape of your church and you got 500 men in there, you can guarantee that 250 of them have a problem with porn.
I think honestly that the best conversation, the healthiest conversation about the reality of pornography is not happening in our churches.
Right.
Churches love to make this a man's problem, so they talk about it at the men's retreat. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a human problem.
Yeah.
More and more women are interested in pornography, especially the younger women. Now, I obviously I'm not I shouldn't be speaking for women at all, but young women have grown up with their smartphones
Yep.
and their devices just like the young men have. Yep. And so the addiction is somewhat leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
And I think that we do a great disservice socially when we say it's a man's problem, and then all the poor little women are victimized. And so now we're creating a culture war, a gender war.
Yeah.
And there's certainly, everybody in pornography is victimized at some level. Now, there are people within the industry who are kind of, I don't know what you would call them, but they are the ones who certainly are the perpetrators. They are the ones
absolutely.
who are drugging people,
Yeah.
And coercing them and extorting them, demanding them. I think the conversation about pornography has to be discussed from a mental and an emotional health perspective.
Right.
I think we also need to talk about it as from a social health perspective. There's no doubt there's a connection between the pornography movement
Yeah.
and human trafficking.
Sex trafficking.
Yeah,
Yeah. And sexual violence.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And so these are very essential conversations that we have to have. And there are a lot of people who are experts in this field. I am not one of them.
But you've helped a lot of men and women in Operation Integrity
Sure,
has. And
sure. And I love the work. I love the conversation.
Yeah.
And given my personal history, I'm considered someone well suited to talk about it, and so I do. I think very practically, from the top down,
Yeah.
there has to be a willing to talk about the subject from a very balanced and informed, broad perspective.
Right.
Not just from the zip up your pants and don't do it anymore because God says. God tells us to do a lot of things, and He loves us no less when we do them anyway.
Yeah, and I think if we think we hold a moral standard, or we're more moral than the next person, right? And we get into this judgmental thing where I look across and go, well, I'm not an addict. I can fool myself.
Right.
And then,
Well,
so we don't want to talk about that necessarily,
Right.
because now we're saying that, hey, look, but the truth is, if morally we're all on the same ground. We all need a savior. We're all fallen. We all have done despicable things. So
well, it's an interesting, it's a both and,
yeah,
because we are all sinners. But until we get explicit and personal about our struggle, then our struggle is just kind of general good news.
no, I agree.
It's not the life transforming thing. So when the guy comes up to me and says, I'm an alcoholic, you want to come sit with
Yes.
me? his confession was his gift to me.
Yeah, and you entered in his world because of where he was. And I think that's what
Right.
what Scripture does say is to confess to one another,
Right.
confess to the Lord, and these are the beginnings of
Right.
you having, whatever you want to call that, the nudging of the Spirit, the courage to go,
Right.
hey, Dave, I need to talk to you.
You know, and a little tidbit of information here that I think is relevant and helpful is that I believe that the most core deceptive aspect of addiction is denial.
Right.
And let me give you a definition of denial. Denial is using a seemingly rational argument to defy my personal reality. Think about that definition when I tell you about this. One of the guys who was on my first board of directors, Roger, he has since passed away. He had passed away of cancer. Roger was a very high functioning attorney, pillar in his community, pillar in his church, who also had an alcohol problem and a pill problem and a prostitute problem. And when he finally came to Operation Integrity and began to address his addictions, he said, I've sat in the church for years listening to guys like you talk, wondering how in the world could you ever do that?
Yeah.
How could you ever be that kind of person when he was that kind of
Yeah,
person?
that was my
But
point. Yeah.
He couldn't see it.
Crazy.
Yeah, he was literally blinded by the splinter in his own eye.
Yeah.
And one of the key aspects of a healthy recovery movement is that we quit looking for the logs in anybody else's
Amen.
eyes, and we start examining our own eyes for the splinters.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Because it's the splinter in my own eye that I don't see that's going to make me a jerk
Yeah.
to a whole lot of people and possibly create a great deal of catastrophe.
Well, and it won't create that empathy inside you that guy came up to you and opened the door and led you
Right.
in. I mean, if all of us have that grace and that empathy and realize right where we are,
Right.
no better than the guy next. I'm just another beggar leading another beggar to Christ, right?
Right.
And I'm just,
Right.
if you offer yourself, which is the greatest thing that you can offer,
Right.
which is when Christ says it about your spiritual act of worship as your body as a sacrifice.
Right.
You offer yourself in the name of Christ, watch what happens.
Right. There came a point in my early recovery, maybe I was kind of 6 months into the process. The same counselor who had confronted me on my counterfeit Christianity, which was a way that we could say it, I was just overwhelmed. I was working a ton. I had to be in this treatment program 40 hours a week. I was scrambling to pay the bills for my attorney, and this program was very expensive. And my girlfriend and I had gone our separate ways, and I was beyond exhausted. And I was suffering tremendous cravings for cocaine,
Well,
just constantly. I wanted cocaine and heroin. And I told him, I was sitting in his office, and he said, so what are you doing after program tonight? I said, I'm going home. I'm just going to go home and go sleep. And what are you doing tomorrow morning? Well, I'll get up and go to work. He said, I tell you what, this is all you got to do. Go home, go to bed, get up in the morning, go to work. Meet me here tomorrow at 4 o'clock and we'll solve all your problems. Can you do that? I go, yeah, I can do that. He said, great, that's all you got to do. See you here tomorrow at 4? I go, yeah. So the next day, I'm down there. I get down there about 2 o'clock. I'm doing stuff.
I know where this is
4
going.
o'clock. Yeah. I didn't at the time. So 4 o'clock, I go knock on his door. He opens the door, almost unexpected. Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing here? I said, you said to be here at 4. He goes, oh, that's right. Yeah. So what are you doing the rest of the day?
Yeah.
Well, I got to be here till about 9, and then we go. And what about tomorrow? Well, I'm going to go to work and come here. I said, great. Check in. Meet me here tomorrow at 4.
Yeah.
And I walked out of his office back to what I was doing, and I was like, oh,
That's all.
that's it.
Yeah.
He taught me the practical principle for this
Pretty
is
powerful.
the day
Yeah.
that the Lord has made.
Let's rejoice and be glad in it. Yeah.
That's it. This is it.
And it's just a day at
It's
a time.
just a day.
Meet me here again at 4. Meet me
That's
here
right.
again at 4. Yeah, that's great.
So,
I have a question. How has your past affected your relationships with women and your romantic life and your those kinds of relationships in your life?
it's been a bit of a hurdle. I had one lady friend that we were talking about getting serious, and she didn't want to introduce me to her father because she knew her father. He would get on Google
Oh, yeah.
and find out.
Yeah.
And you know what? I understood.
Yeah.
We're still friends. I love her to death. And no real hard feelings. There was some disappointment there.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I've had a few situations like that. I'm a very content man. I'm not married. Don't need to be married. When I was a boy, all I could think about was growing up and getting married and being a husband and a father. And there's been some ongoing work for me to come to terms with the fact that wasn't going to happen. Along with the sadness of not being a husband and father, I make great uncle material.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm kind of an adopted uncle to a whole lot of
I
kids.
bet.
Yeah. Big
and-
brother, I would imagine,
Yeah,
to a lot of guys.
a lot of big brothering
Yeah.
that I really enjoy. And I have a freedom to do things and to live in such a way. I can do this. I know there are a number of guys who, with very similar histories, similar to mine, that they can't do this because they have wife and children to think about. And I respect them for that.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap the show up with this. If you had one thing to say to a group of people and you only had 1 minute to say it, what would you say? Look in that camera and say it to them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful to be here with Bob and Bub, and your best days are ahead of you. And your greatest pain is the doorway through which God will bring you his greatest gift of redemption.
I love it. Love you, brother. Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks.
See you guys next time. God bless.
God bless.
Wow.